and welcome to the 4th episode of the Expressive Watercolor series. In today's class, I'm going to be breaking down how to do 2 separate parts of this project. The first is filling in the Sharpie portion of your portrait. And when we're doing that, we're going to make sure that we're only filling in the solid black sections. So you are not filling in any of the intricate details, and you are not filling in any of the areas that transition from dark to medium to light. So we're going to fill in our solid black sections, and then we're going to be adding in all of our watercolor over the top of our Sharpie. The reason why this works well is because Sharpie is a permanent marker and will not be blurred when we add the water from the watercolor over the top of it. However, if you do add any of your V5 before you add in your watercolor, it's going to bleed like crazy. So it's really important that you only complete the Sharpie portion of this project before you add your watercolor. So this is what my portrait was. So I show you how I go through and transfer this image onto your paper, and just keep in mind that it's essentially tracing. Like, you don't have to know how to draw this face. We're really just more concerned with your use of value in your pen and your watercolor techniques. So you're going to transfer this image onto your final piece of paper, and this is after I've added in all of the watercolor and everything too. So this is 2 different steps that you're completing. But first I filled in all of the Sharpie sections, and again, I only filled in the solid black areas. So I sort of outlined the spots where I knew I was going to have lighter areas, or maybe even sections that were fading with my V5 pen. So I went through and filled in all of my solid black sections, and then I went through with my watercolor and added in all kinds of fun techniques. And I really had a great time, because I feel like often when you're making art, you want it to be very precise and perfect, and this is the opposite of that. So you can color or paint outside the lines, you can splatter wherever you want, you can get crazy. So this part is really fun, and I'll explain all of the steps of how to do that in this episode. The first step is to cut your reference photo paper so that it matches the size of the final draft paper, which is 8 by 10 inches. So I would recommend taking your final draft paper, and you can even line it up with the borders of where your image ends, where you printed it on your reference paper, so that you can make sure that you don't have to come up with the details that would be in those sections. I used a pencil to just trace onto my reference photo page where that edge is going to go. Then I actually cut off the scrap edges off of my printed reference photo page. We are using the transferring method to get this image onto our final draft paper. So to help myself not have to fill in the entire background of this page, I gave myself an outline on the back of my paper so that I could know where I actually needed to fill it in. I used a 6B pencil to fill this in all the way, and I made sure to press fairly hard. I had to continuously sharpen my pencil because using your pencil this way does make it go dull very quickly, and we want to make sure we're filling in those sections all the way. So keeping it nice and sharp is really helpful, and filling it in really dark and not leaving any empty patches is really important. Then I flipped my paper over and lined it up with the top edge of my final draft paper, and we're going to tape this down, so we want to make sure that it's nice and even. You're going to use a strip of masking tape, and you're going to make sure that it goes from one end to the other, or fairly close, because we want to have this nice and secure so that it can't wiggle around as we're doing our transfer. I placed it on the front first and just made sure that it lined up with like the halfway mark, and then I lifted up my paper and folded my piece of tape over that edge to make sure that it was secured onto my final draft. We don't need to add tape anywhere else because we want to be able to lift this up back and forth to check that we've got all of our details transferred. Next, I used a mechanical pencil, but a sharp pencil would be just fine to do this step with. And I went through and outlined all of the sections where my value was nice and solid, and I made sure to circle any areas that had highlights inside of them. So I didn't go through and do like every single little detail for this step. I really just went up to the solid edges where it was like the last part of it being filled in solid black before it reached those transition sections where there's medium tones. So I just went through and made my outline as far out to that edge as I possibly could up until where those transitions started, and I made sure that I was circling or outlining any highlights so that I didn't accidentally fill those in. For this portion of the transfer, we're really just trying to get those basic solid shapes. So as you can see in my end result here, they are very, very basic shapes that I'm going to go through and fill in with my Sharpie. The order we're completing this in is filling in our solid black with our Sharpie. We're going to go over the top of that with our watercolor because the Sharpie is permanent and will not bleed when we add our watercolor over the top of it. And then our final step will be to come back through and add all of those medium tones and transitions and intricate details with our V5 pen. So we're just filling in these solid sections with our Sharpie first, and we'll come back through later on to add in those transitions and details with the V5 after our watercolor has been added. So to begin filling in these sections, I just took my Sharpie and kind of outlined those edges and worked to fill it in. I thought it was helpful to use the side of the Sharpie pen rather than just the point, and that helped me fill it in a little bit faster. So I just went through and filled in all of these solid sections, and it can get a little bit confusing for some areas just because it's easy to forget whether you outlined it because it's supposed to be left white or if you outlined it because you're supposed to fill it in black. So quite often I would flip my paper back over to just double check that I was filling in the correct color rather than just trying to guess. There were some sections that were in my photograph that were filled in just super solid black, and I decided I wanted to add my own details there. So for example, in this section of the hair, there was actually no real highlight in that area. I just kind of added it myself because I wanted to create some more visual interest and not just have such large sections of black. So feel free to add in some highlighted areas that you may choose not to fill in solid black, just so that you don't have like huge giant sections of your picture that are filled in. As you can see here, I added a couple of different highlighted areas, and that was just a personal preference. Filling in these solid black sections can be a little time consuming, and just working with the side of your Sharpie, outlining it first and then filling in the centers is what I would recommend. And this is what my piece looked like when I had all of the Sharpie sections filled in. So remember that it's just the solid areas of black, none of the intricate details, and none of the areas where it's actually fading to get lighter. The next step is to add watercolor. So to help myself, I really considered the parts of this example that I liked. I really liked that the section of the forehead had some gradient values in it. I liked that I had some of those splatters that were like coming off of the hair in an interesting way. I really liked the wet on wet sections of the flowers. So I just considered how I was going to incorporate those. And it is really helpful to just take a look at the skill building that you completed so that you can make sure you're adding in enough of these techniques. So I'm considering where I'm going to put each of these techniques to make sure that I have 3 or more separate identifiable watercolor techniques that you can see visibly in my portrait. Next, I used my color practice section to help me choose which color scheme I was going to use. To begin, I decided to use my gradient wash to help me encourage the shadow that was just directly underneath the hairline there. So I'm going to use that same technique that we practiced on our skill building, where I load my brush with that color only one time, and then I'm slowly removing it from my brush by dipping in the water, dabbing on my paper towel, adding a stroke. Then I dip in my water, dab on my paper towel, and add a stroke, and that's helping me slowly remove the pigment from my brush. I also decided to just go back through with a darker stroke to help encourage that really dark shadow that's up against the hairline. One really nice part about this project is the freedom that you have to not make everything perfect. So I just went through and added some random color patches, like for the eyelids, and just to kind of accentuate some of the shadows that I've got along her cheeks. And it was really kind of freeing to just not have to care whether they were in the perfect exact spot or not. I just kind of played around with my colors, trying to fill in some of my colors from my color scheme while just really having some fun. Another technique that I used was adding some very liquidy pigment to a toothbrush and using my thumb to kind of spray that along the side of her cheek. And I used that to kind of show that gradation where it's fading out to white in that section. And I thought it was kind of cute. It sort of looked like her freckles a little bit. So it was just an interesting way to incorporate that. And I went through and just thought through which colors would be darker to incorporate in certain areas, like using that very dark version of the orange for her lips to help those stand out. I continued to add in patches of color, but I was trying to be very aware of where the highlights would be and where my light source was coming from, so that as I added the shading in for this neck, for example, I didn't fill in the center because that's where the light was most likely hitting in that section of the picture. Once I had the majority of the skin painted with one sort of set of colors, I moved on to painting the hair with the other side of my complementary color scheme. So I took some of the blues and just worked on adding in some of that paint and worked with a lot of water to kind of help me make sure my techniques would stand out and to give myself some depth. Another technique that I incorporated was including salt, and to make that work I had to apply a lot of water in this section, or else it would not really do anything if it landed on top of a mostly dry surface. So I filled in a section of blue and added some little grains of salt, making sure that it was actually pooling around those spots, because if it wasn't, that means that I need more water. I wanted to add in some bigger splatters with my blue, and to protect the rest of my painting, I took a scrap piece of paper and put it over the top of the face so that when I started tapping my paintbrush on my finger, it wasn't actually getting those blue splatters onto the face. So that was really helpful for me to make sure that I wasn't ruining the work that I had done before or getting that in an area I didn't want it to be in. Next, I just used a little bit of water from my cup and filled in this section of hair and added some darker versions of that blue over the top of it so that they would have a really fun wet on wet effect where the edges were super smooth and fading. Then I added some more water to a section to make sure that this step worked really well, but I took a piece of saran wrap and laid it over the top of those sections, making sure that I had a light area and a dark area so that you could actually see where the saran wrap was filling in the gaps. If you try to place saran wrap over the top of just one consistent color, it's typically harder for you to see the effect that the saran wrap has. I also decided to go outside the lines in a couple of spots and to start getting more and more expressive. So just loosening up a little bit and feeling like I was free, that I didn't have to just fill in just inside of the lines. Here you can see me making a really fine mist with the toothbrush, and that was a really fun thing to do, to just feel free to add as much splatters as I wanted to. I continued adding some more sections, just painting in areas, and here you can see me adding in a section of yellow, then a little bit of my orange over the top to get that wet on wet effect, and then I did incorporate some saran wrap in that area as well. In this bottom left corner, you can see that I started to let some of my blue and orange mix together to create a neutral, a color that's sort of like in between the two, and that's perfectly fine to do. I thought it helped to make that section just a little bit darker to really show that that was a shirt and separate from the hair above it. I also incorporated some of that neutrally color up at the top of the hair just to create some more variety in that larger plain section. So this is what my project looked like at this phase, where I had completed all of my filled in Sharpie sections and all of my expressive watercolor, while incorporating at least 3 very visible and distinct watercolor techniques. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this episode. I hope that it was helpful for you to see the steps on how to break down your Sharpie sections and fill them in solidly, and also for you to see how to apply the watercolor techniques that we learned in our last episode. So I am excited for you to continue on to the next step, where you are adding in all of your intricate details and all of the areas where your pen value will be fading with your V5 pen. So I'll see you for the next episode. Thanks for watching.